Welcome to our fourth panel in honor of Women's History Month 2022. This year, we adopted the theme, Breaking the Bias, Philly Women at Work, to highlight the incredible work women are doing every day. We also know there are a variety of reasons that women and other people have when it comes to difficulties finding jobs or becoming more economically empowered. Luckily, there are a variety of resources available that can help people in this search. Tonight's panel will feature individuals from a variety of organizations and positions who work to help people in this way. My name is Tori Potenza, and I am the program manager for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us tonight, and anyone that is watching either live or the recording that will be available later. Joining me today as a co-moderator is a student from Kensington Kappa, Omar Cabrera, who's graciously offered to help deliver questions to our panelists when we get started. In terms of logistics, we will give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then I will turn things over to Omar for questions. So our first panelist is Javita Hill, Director of the Office of Engagement for Women. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your position, and your office?
Okay, so it's the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women, which also in that office is the Philadelphia Commission for Women, which I am also the Executive Director. And basically, we are, by legislation, actually, we are mandated to provide a forum and recommendations to the mayor and to city council and policymakers on issues of gender equity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and sharing. Our next panelist is Amy Nevs, Executive Director of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. Could you tell us a little more about yourself, your position, and your office?
Thanks for having me tonight. My name is Amy Nevs. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Executive Director for the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, which also holds the Office of ADA Compliance and the Mayor's Commission on People with Disabilities. And so in many ways, we are similar to the Women's Commission in that we provide a forum and an opportunity for residents to advocate for systemic change within the administration and bring forward needs in their community for us to work on together. And so these two offices work to ensure that Philadelphia is inclusive and accessible to all residents. An additional note about myself is I do also share the lived experience as a person with disabilities and bilateral hearing loss. I identify as a neurodivergent, and I bring forward my personal lived experience into the role, as well as being the primary caregiver for 3 children with developmental disabilities. I spent the last 20 years of my career focused on disability rights here in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're glad to have you tonight. And then last but not least, we have Diane, Carmen, Levy, Executive Director of Women's Way. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Yes, thank you. I'm so honored to be here. My name's Diane Carmen Levy. I'm actually changed my title to Chief Disruptor because it's about disrupting systems that are grounded in exploitation and oppression. And Women's Way has been around for about 44 years, and they were the first funding federation dedicated to the advancement of women and girls in the entire country. So our mission is about really advancing the rights of and opportunities for women and girls and those who identify as women to achieve gender and racial equity for all. So we are about disrupting systems that have over the course of the history of this country have oppressed women, particularly women of color, because of the intersection of gender, race, and also sexual orientation, to really attack those systemic barriers that will enable all women and all those who identify as women to thrive in our region. So I'm so glad to be here, and thank you so much.
It might be the coolest job title I've ever heard. I love that so much. I have to write that down and remember that. So thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. I am now going to turn things over to Omar to continue our discussion. If you don't mind giving our panelists the first question.
Hi. The first question is, what have been some of the most rewarding experiences for you in your role or organization?
I'll be glad
Sure.
to. Oh,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Jovita.
No, I was going to say that early on, we advocated for the sweetened beverage tax. That was huge because what that sweetened beverage tax made childcare accessible and affordable. And so I'm really very proud of the work we did on advocating for the sweetened beverage tax. We also had a big win in the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. For the first time ever, domestic workers get a contract. And in that contract, their hours are specified. They get paid leave, paid vacation, and it's transportable from one employer to another. I mean, that's revolutionary because also it is an occupation that was rife with wage theft. So now the Office of Labor monitors the contracts. There's a place where women can go to, because when I talk about domestic workers, we are talking about an occupation predominantly of women and predominantly Black and brown women. I'm also very proud that after 3 years of litigation, we finally won on the wage equity bill, where employers are no longer allowed to ask people their salary history. Because basically that salary history question had the effect of keeping people in low wage jobs for practically their entire work lives. So those are some of the things that I'm most proud of.
Oh, so it's hard act to follow, Jovita. I think, Women's Way has been around for 44 years, unfortunately, because we're still fighting the fight for equity, gender equity, and justice. And I think one of the things we've been doing so well is really changing the philanthropic sector to really understand that when you invest in women and those who identify as women, when women thrive, we all thrive. It is a great return on our investment because not only is it helping those who are women, who identify as women, to improve their lives, but they also invest in their children, their families, their communities. And so the return on investment is huge. So I think there's a shift now on really, how do we create an equitable, inclusive environment? And our pitch is, when you invest in women, you invest in our families, our communities, and our local and national economy. And so I think there is a mental shift in many stakeholders at this point. And I also believe that in order to create an inclusive democracy and economy that works for everyone, we have to change the mental models of key stakeholders. And I think they're starting to open up and they're starting to listen. And they're starting to realize that when we exclude and deny and oppress women at the intersection of race, gender, sexual orientation, that we are really hurting all of us. And so I think, we're doing a lot around changing the narrative and therefore changing the mental models of those who are really key decision makers in our economy. So, yeah. I mean, it's a long-term process, but I really feel there's great momentum right now.
Awesome. So I think it's hard to narrow down what's most rewarding. I think what's most rewarding is being part of changing the conversation around what accessibility looks like, and that it's everyone's responsibility to ensure equity and inclusion and accessibility. And, I'm proud to serve in the Kenney administration, which is the first administration to not only do a self-assessment of the city's city-owned facilities and programs and departments related to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which will turn 32 years old this summer. And so think about that, 3 decades it took the city of Philadelphia to be reflective in that way. And so we thank Mayor Kenny for that leadership. And then we are currently implementing that plan. So we have assessed more than 537 facilities and programs and are working our way through a 5-year plan to make those corrective actions to ensure that the city is not only compliant, but fully accessible and inclusive, because compliance and inclusion are 2 different things. And we really want to shift that conversation away from it just being about fulfilling our obligation, but changing it to a cultural shift in our city where everyone has a sense of belonging and are included in our program space, in our physical and built environment, in our social spaces as well. And so I'm proud to be the one to have a lot of call-in moments with my colleagues, not call out, but call in about best practices and putting accessibility at the forefront, providing interpretation services. Closed captions cost you nothing to click a button. And I'm proud to say that when I joined the office about a year ago, as a person with profound deafness on one side and hearing loss on the other, is I rely on closed captioning to participate in the conversation and an event like this. But unfortunately at the time, Microsoft Teams was not enabled to have closed captioning, which also meant that City Council uses that for their public meetings. Our many departments use Teams, and we have relied on Microsoft Teams throughout the pandemic. And so through my own ADA accommodations request, we were able to change that for not only myself, but for 30,000 employees, all of our departments, City Council, and for all residents that access our meetings on a daily basis. And so when we think about access, we have to stop thinking about it about serving one person who's requesting it, is that it can have an impact of change for everyone around us. I think one of the other things most recently is our office recently produced a disabilities characteristics map of Philadelphia, utilizing the most recent US Census data from 2020. And when I presented this map to City Council in January, I actually got emotional because it was the first time that people with disabilities were the leading demographic and data set that we looked at when we looked at a picture of our city. And so every neighborhood is represented on that map. And what the beautiful part about that map, it's a beautiful depiction. It is in gradient scales of blue. And it demonstrates that that blue level represents how many people with disabilities live in that neighborhood. And every single neighborhood is highlighted on that map because people with disabilities and women with disabilities and caregivers live in every single neighborhood of our city. And so it's changing that conversation. It's informing policies, it's informing regulations, and it is shifting our lens of how we look at disabilities, because it's not just about 16%, it's about all of us. So those are the things that get me most excited about when I come to work. And lastly is that we are a small office. It is myself and my director of ADA compliance and my constituent service coordinator, and we are all women. We are all women that have lived experience with disability, with oppression, and breaking the bonds of poverty. And so I'm very proud to serve with my team to serve Philadelphia.
Well, thank you. Now, the next question is, what resources does your organization have to serve women and other marginalized population in Philadelphia?
Well, I guess I'll go again. Thank you, Amy, because you have been very inspirational. I am so pleased that pretty soon we will be initiating a citywide survey. And that citywide survey that we're calling The Future of Work for Women in Philadelphia will highlight what really is the real life situation for Philadelphia's women. One of the things that also inspired it was that we know that there were certain conditions that existed before the pandemic. Then the pandemic came along And whatever those fissures were in the world of work for women, it was exacerbated. And so what we want to look at in this survey is what is it that women need to work productively, not only in the workplace, but what works not only for them, their income, and their families. So I'm pleased that that's on the horizon, that we will be following in Amy's footsteps in terms of having documentation about what Philadelphia's women need in conjunction with their work lives. Also, in terms of resources, if anybody is welcome to go to the Philadelphia Commission for Women's webpage, and Philadelphia's websites, it's not like I have a www. But if you can Google the Philadelphia Commission for Women, or you can Google the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women, and there you will find resources, like I said, COVID-19 resources for women, domestic abuse resources. You'll find leadership resources for girls and women, education resources. So we have like 6 or 7 resource guides on that page, depending on what it is that you're looking for. So those are some of the things that are that we have in terms of resources for women.
I'll go next. We're kind of an interesting hybrid Women's Way. So one thing we do is we do a lot of grant making. So we actually build the capacity organizations that serve predominantly women and girls in the greater Philadelphia region. And we have an immediate response action fund, which is a rapid response funding grant program, which frankly, we've been doing long before the pandemic. Suddenly foundations could figure out how to get money out there quickly, where we were doing it since 2017. And so we actually really bridge a gap in philanthropy. It helps nonprofits who are working with women and girls to address immediate and urgent needs. We make a decision within 10 days and we get the money out there and they get a check within 10 days. So that's a rotating, rolling application. We also just launched a general operating fund for nonprofits that are out there. And because we know that nonprofits need just general operating support, and it's a multi-year, 2-year grant, they decide what to do with that money. It's not about us making decisions. It's about those on the ground who make those decisions. We also started a financial coaching training program. We know that many women and girls just lack access to financial education and really don't understand how to manage finances. So we launched a financial coaching training program where we train providers that work with women and girls to incorporate financial coaching into their programs. So we work with nonprofit organizations, but we're now starting to work also with membership-based organizations and grassroots organizations. So we're actually working with the Domestic Workers Alliance of Pennsylvania to actually train their members to train other members of how to do financial coaching. And one thing that we really love, and Javita's been involved in this, is the Change the Narrative Fellowship Program. We believe that those women that are most impacted by economic injustices are closest to the solutions. And we need to elevate their voices, their experiences, and perspectives. So we actually run a fellowship program. It's a 7-month program where we train and empower women with lived experiences to tell their stories in a way that will help them become more effective social agents within their communities, within their organizations. And so we actually we help build their skills to do this and connect them to 3 different audiences: media, philanthropy, and policymakers. So it's also trying to develop relationship for those who have experienced economic injustices and those most impacted by economic injustices to be seen as subject matter experts and to be at the table with policymakers, with funders, and with media and journalists. So that is something we do every year. We're in the midst of our 2nd cohort, but we will be implementing it next year. And people can apply to it. It is a paid fellowship program. The women are paid because they are subject matter experts. But we also build a whole support group and network of these women that we then connect them to these different audiences: media, philanthropy, and policymakers. And we're doing a huge research project, which I won't get into, but it's basically going to create this first gender wealth index in our region. And we just got funding to get that implemented because we need, and part of the research, I'm going to say this, is we're going to do a huge qualitative aspect of getting the voices and perspectives of those most impacted by economic injustices, i.e. women of color, to be able to inform us about the research, about solutions and strategies. So that will be starting to be implemented this summer of 2022.
So in our office, we are all about the resources. That's often what most people come to us for, is information. And so information equity is a huge initiative of our office, is to ensure that residents have equitable access to the information available. And so we are constantly sharing out. We do this in public forums. We also do targeted conversations. We will be kicking off some community conversations around public safety with the police commissioner. Then we're going to be talking about affordable and accessible housing with city council members and other offices. And we're going to continue to, as the needs arise in the community, is meet them where they're at with those types of conversations. I mentioned our constituent service coordinator earlier, and so her job is primarily triaging the amount of phone calls and inquiries that we get on a daily basis where people are generally asking for help. Women make up the majority of those that reach out to us for assistance. They are also largely caregivers. And so it can go from housing. A day can look like someone needs assistance with housing, rent assistance. It might be signing up for formal services, a provider difficulty, transportation. It could be that a SEPTA elevator is down and they alert our office. And so we never know what will be on the other end of the phone. But we have a plethora of available resources and relationships. And I think relationships are really important because I don't have all the answers and I don't have all of the staffing that's needed. And so we can have requests for home modifications. Well, we have resources for that. We have them both available in digital form and booklet form because many people with disabilities don't have access to technology and are still homes without computers or smartphones. And so it's important that even though we're in a digital age, we still take the time to make sure our resources are available in print. And when they're not, we'll print it off and we'll make sure they get it. So that's something that I think is important. I think that we also offer trainings both to departments to help them know what's available for residents with disabilities and caregivers. And then I think it's also important that the community have opportunity to attend training. So I mentioned that map. I'll drop the link in the chat and make sure it's shared with attendees. Is that on April 6th, I will be hosting a 1-hour session in the evening to walk folks that are interested in how to utilize the map, how to navigate it. So a mini tutorial, and then also the diverse ways in which it can inform you work, from grant opportunities like Diane was talking about, whether it is just expanding how you think about your outreach to be more inclusive of the needs of the community, because this map not only shows the type of disability, it shows the age and the race and ethnicity of those residents. And so we can walk through those neighborhoods, because not only we know that on average 16% of Philadelphians are people with disabilities, but this map will show you that some neighborhoods that's as high as 42.6%. And a significant amount of neighborhoods are over 25%. And then at the same time, you will see a trend that they are also the disparities and mostly populated by BIPOC individuals. And in one neighborhood where it's over 40%, they are primarily of multi-races, and also more than 90% are mentioned that they are of Hispanic origin. And so I think it's important to note that when a neighborhood identifies in those ways, that we need to change the way in which we reach that neighborhood and how our resources are categorized. So we're using this map to really be a resource to everyone in the community for whatever you might need it for. So those are the ways in which we are supporting making sure people have equitable access to information and resources.
Well, how has your work changed or grown over the years?
I guess we'll keep the same order, huh? I also would like to piggyback on something that Diane said in the sense that people who are closest to the problem or are closest to the solution, we came in with a participatory stakeholder model of how we were going to do our engagement, how we were going to do our work. And out of that, we sought funding, and Women's Way was one of our funders. We probably were one of the first departments in the entire city that had Women with Lived Experience Fund, which meant that if we were sitting around any table where there were people who that was their job to be there, our experts would be getting a stipend for being there too, because you can't tell people that you value them and you value their expertise and everybody else is getting paid except for them. And so we made raising money for the Women with Lived Experience Fund, we made that a priority in our office. And so, and I appreciate Diane, because until I started thinking about that in several ways, I was inspired by the Changing the Narrative project. I also, very early on, we were doing a roundtable on women and reentry, and incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. And we had people from the Justice Department, City Hall, City Council, we had legislators, but the most important people at that table were formerly incarcerated women. And as one of my commissioners and we were walking to go and have dinner, she handed one of the women an envelope. And that envelope had a transpass in it and a check. And that's when I said, oh, the people whose expertise we value, they should be getting paid. So it's not a lot. And but it also is symbolic of how much we value what they bring to the table. And so I'm very, very proud of that. And so now, after I said that, what was the question?
So the question was, how has your work changed or grown over the years?
I think for all of us, the pandemic has changed a lot. So say, for instance, pre-pandemic, I would not have been to 4 meetings today. Because all my meetings have been on Zoom. So you can go from one meeting to the next, and there have been times when I've had 2 laptops going and monitoring 2 meetings. And so that has changed. The idea that yesterday was my first in-person meeting in 2 years. And I did a presentation with high schoolers at a Friend Select. And it was such a joy to finally do in person. And Diane and I have done a lot of stuff together. And there have been in-person things that we planned and planned and planned. And then the pandemic shifted and we had to redo what we were planning. As a matter of fact, I think it's been as long ago as 2019 when we began planning the Trust Black Women Equitable Philanthropy.
Yes.
We will finally be doing it in June at last. So I think the biggest change in our work has been how we have been able to pivot because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'll go next. Jovita, I love working with Jovita. I think, Women's Way always had this mission of equity, right? Gender equity. And yet when I came there 5 years ago, I said, so what's your theory of change? What do you mean by equity? And you know what, I think they were doing it, but it was still very much, how do we change individual behavior versus how do we deal with the systemic historical root causes of gender and racial and sexual, all those inequities, right? So I said, so guess what? We're going to change our theory of change. We're going to say the major driver of all inequities is white supremacy. And it was a very scary thing to do for me because as a white woman and in a board that was predominantly white at that time, I thought, you know what, I could lose my job, I could get fired, I don't care. We need to talk about what is the key driver of all inequities in our country from the beginning of this country. And so I started talking about white supremacy long before it's kind of cool now to do it, right? I'm being a little cynical here, but now everyone's like, oh yeah, we had to do DEI work. We had to, and I'm like, you know what? We need to talk about it. And then how do we put that in action? How do we operationalize dismantling white supremacy? And so that is our key theory of change. That is something we talk about with everyone, with our donors, who are many white wealthy people who have actually, frankly, have gained from white supremacy. And frankly, philanthropy doesn't want to change things because they're part of the system, right? So when you talk about it, you're really putting yourselves at risk for losing funding and losing a lot of things, but I don't care. We have to talk about it. And so that was a major shift in women's way, right? And we're connecting the dots for people. So when we talk about reproductive justice, how does white supremacy play out in that? When we talk about housing inequities, how does white supremacy affect that? Everything, right? And of course, those at the bottom of the economic pyramid are those who are women, who identify as women, transgender, LGBTQ, people of color, people with disabilities, because of the racialized, gendered hierarchy of human value that's based on white supremacy. So we are working to dismantle that whole thing, which is very challenging. And we're also shifting from an anti-poverty framework to an asset building framework. We know, and the pandemic highlighted this, the most economically precarious people are women of color because of the intersection of gender and race, and also people with disabilities. And so helping people get jobs is not enough. Many women and people who are at the bottom of the economic pyramid have 1, 2, 3 jobs, and they're still very poor. We need to start talking about asset buildings, wealth building, right? That really allows people to thrive and make choices and pass on those assets to their children, to the next generation, and deal with intergenerational poverty. But grounded in that is the mental models of all those people that are in government, for-profit, nonprofit, philanthropy, even in the social service sector. They have adopted this white supremacy mentality, whether they think they have or not, and we have to challenge it and dismantle it. And part of the work we do is changing narratives. I think narrative change is critical to changing mental models of folks. So that's a big shift in what Women's Way is doing. And I have to say, I'm really honored to be part of that shift. It's long overdue.
You're here to that for all of us, I think. Thinking about the question about how the work has changed and my approach to the work. I've been in this role about a year, but I've been in this space of DEI work and advocacy for about 20 years, and really since the day I was born, with differences. So it's what I live. However, I used to really take it on as though I was leading the way and being in a protective almost way and trying to take on every problem and every barrier and trying to fix it. And if you're constantly trying to address all of the needs around you, you will find yourself at a state of burnout very, very quickly. And it's also quite emotionally taxing to do this work. And so if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're not prioritizing your mental health and your restoration, because there will always be the work to do. And the reality is, you know, we only have one life to live. And when that day comes that we're done, we're done. And guess what? The work is still going to remain. And so we cannot destroy ourselves in the process of trying to build change. And so that's something that I really try, and it takes time, because I think as women, we've been trained to apologize for our presence. We are trained to multitask and overachieve. We are always asked to show up in a polite and professional manner. And yet the work can be so taxing that there is no energy for that, or to take care of it, or you're managing caregiving and work. And at one time I was working 4 jobs as a single mom in poverty and never having enough for my 3 kids. And knowing that childcare was out of reach and a sustainable job was out of reach. And I just had to stay on this perpetual wheel of exhaustion. And so what's shift for me in the work is that I try to leverage relationships. And I try to build networks and talk about the conversation being different, and that it's not my responsibility solely to elicit change. It's every resident in Philadelphia's responsibility. And so I have to figure out, where can I leverage relationships and where can I meet the most eminent need at this time that is movable. And I say that because sometimes there are eminent needs that are not movable at this moment. They might be movable later. And I tell my team and others a lot that you can't go around banging your head on the concrete and think you're not going to get a headache. So, I think that for me, that has been a shift for me, and it's intentional work. So I prioritize restoration for my team, but I also, on the second hand, just like Jovita said, there are days where I will have more than 12 meetings in a day and I will not have taken a breath. And I have to say, nope, we're not going to do that today because I'll burn out. And so I think that's something that has shifted for me, and also not apologizing for the space that this work takes up, because it is going to be uncomfortable for folks.
Yep.
It is going to take time. And also, I no longer ask for people to be aware of disability, equity, and inclusion. I am asking for your action. Your awareness means nothing without backing it up with action and with your money. And so if it's not in the budget, you're not committed to racial equity. If it's not in the budget, you are not committed to gender equality. If it's not in the budget, you are not committed to accessibility. And so that has been a shift for me, to be bold enough to not apologize for what is required to do this work. And that is that it has to be supported in action and in the budget. So if it's not in the budget, I don't believe you that you have prioritized those initiatives.
I'd like to say hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Yes.
That was just awesome, awesome, awesome. And I like to quote Joe Biden all the time. Joe Biden said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget, and I will know what you value." And so I agree with Amy, I agree with Diane, and the whole, what I say to people all the time around the whole idea of gender justice. Gender justice and racial justice are inexplicably tied, and you cannot have one without the
other. And I just want to say, self-care is an act of feminism and equity. Self-care is a way to dismantle white supremacy. So, thank you, Amy, for bringing that up. I mean, it's so critical. And put your money where your mouth is. And here's what I say to funders. It's not about how much money you give out. It's what you give up. And what I'm saying to funders now is, you need to give up the decision-making power and give it to those who are impacted by injustices. It's not enough to just give money out, right? So it's all about these bold conversations that we need to have, and acting, like putting your money where your mouth is, acting, it's not enough, like you just said, Amy, to talk about it. And frankly, I think we're all tired of just the talk, right? So, I just want to put that out there. And I'm putting it out there to philanthropy that says, oh, well, we give money out. No, that's your tax write-offs. That's your way of not paying taxes. What are you giving up? Give up control and power and decision-making power. That's more meaningful.
Absolutely. I just want to add one last thing about allyship in this space is a colleague of mine recently, Amani Barwin, who's an amazing activist. She has a lot of channels. She goes by Crutches and Spice. So shout out to her. But she recently did a talk about, remember that kid on the playground that gave himself the nickname, right? It's different. It's different when you earn your nickname than when you give yourself the nickname. And so for allies, to women, to the LGBT community, to the disability community, did you give yourself that name, or did the community give it to you by your actions or what you've done? And I think that, so full credit to her because she has sparked that. But I think it's important to talk about that, is that, a lot of leaders, it looks good for you to say that you value DEI and you value women and you value the disability community, the LGBT community, and that you're there with them. But when it comes time for decision-making and the powers and the policy and who's influencing things, are you an ally in those moments? And are you an ally when you are prioritizing your budget?
Yep. Yeah, it just real quickly, when I went to this conference and I said, we pay women with lived experiences, we pay them, for everything that they do. And they're like, well, how do you do that? And what do you mean, how do we do that? It's in our budget. It's a priority in our budget, just like anything else you put in your budget. So yes, Amy, I hear you.
Well, thank you for all your inspiring words. What are some first steps you would suggest for women and or families seeking different types of work or career resources?
I can mix it up and go first.
Bingo.
Because when I looked at this question, I thought back many years ago when I was really struggling as a young mom, trying to manage their care, my care, and, just trying to get us out of poverty into a place of stability. And I always felt like I must not be working hard enough. I must not be enough. And the reality is, I think the first step is to recognize that you are enough exactly where you are. You are doing more than you need to be doing, and that there are all these other powers of oppression and things that are impacting your ability to make progress. It's not your failure that you are not making the progress that you'd like to see for yourself or your family at this time. And, just this week, I had gone into a local shop on my lunch break at a city hall, and I am always coming to work with a sense of gratitude. And I went in there and there was a young mom filling out a job application with her toddler running around the restaurant. And I smiled at her so big, and I was so incredibly proud of her because it takes guts. It takes guts as a young mom. It takes guts to show up in those spaces, to go after a job, and you're still juggling your child. And she didn't bother her one bit. She was filling that out, and I said to the manager, you should hire her. Because it shows commitment and it shows that she's going to show up. And I think that if more women and families don't be afraid to show up exactly how you are and where you are right now, because just like Diane was saying, your lived experience or your lived expertise is going to get you where you are. One other thing that I would encourage you is, I got most of my experience through volunteer experience, not paid opportunities. I serve on several boards. I serve the governor in 2 different oversight councils for the state of Pennsylvania, and I've done it for many years. And there were years where I could barely afford the gas to get out to Harrisburg to do volunteer work. And people thought I was nuts, that I was struggling in poverty, but I was learning and I was growing and I was building relationships and I was building an entourage of people that still cheer for me today to be where I am. And my children have been shown that just because you're not getting paid doesn't mean that it's not going to be valuable to you. Now, that doesn't mean you say yes to everything. And that doesn't mean that when you're asked to advise on something, you should not be paid for your lived experience or your lived expertise. You absolutely should. I think one resource that I love to always shout out is the Free Libraries of Philadelphia. Have such a plethora of free resources for you around job training, resume building, free headshots. There are people that can help you along the way. And I think between Jovita, Diane, and myself, our offices are here for you at every step, as well as resources and pointing you in the right way, whether it's job clothes, whether it's finding nighttime childcare, whatever that might be. I think we can all come together to surround you because you're enough exactly where you're at. So keep working and keep striving and just keep showing up, because if a woman can show up to a job shop, to a job to apply for an application with her child, then you can too. And, you know, I think if we just keep showing up and not apologizing for the experiences of our families and where we are, we can do anything that we need to do or want to do.
You know what that reminds me of, Amy? One of my academic heroes is Robert Putnam, because one of the things that he's a Harvard professor, and one of the things that he said, and this is about volunteering, that civic engagement gives you social and political capital. I would not be where I am. I would not be as successful at what I do in practically every aspect of my career had it not been for civic engagement. And again, what that does, civic engagement, that buys you social and political capital. So I would encourage people to invest in themselves because you get that capital.
Ditto to everything you both said. I just want to reemphasize the lived experience, because when you talk about women, particularly women who are caregivers, who are navigating gross injustices every day of their lives, right? Their skills are profound. Their ability to be resourceful, creative, resilient, courageous, it could go a long way in the workforce. So I'm going to reiterate what Amy just said too, and Jovita. Just because there's not dollars behind your experiences doesn't mean they're less valid. Your lived experiences are the greatest asset you can bring to any workforce. And frankly, which is really great, there are now employers looking at the value of lived experiences, not just your degrees, not what previous jobs you've held, and elevate those experiences and how you can bring them to the work environment. We have changed our requirements for people working at Women's Way. We don't even require degrees. It's great, but frankly, we value lived experiences that much, right? And so I think doing a deep reflective process of looking at everything you do to manage your life and all the skills that you do to do that every day, those are the skills that we need in our workforce. You know, and I can't think of a better employee than women that have dealt, particularly women who have, that have dealt with all these adversities and continue to persevere. So I say to you, you are creative, resourceful, and whole. Trust yourself, have faith in yourself, and do that deep reflective work of everything that you've used and continue to use to support yourself, your family, right? And those are valuable skills and character traits that we need in the workforce, that we need today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate hearing all of your wonderful insight. Just very quickly before we wrap up, I'd love if you could all offer up just a few parting words of wisdom and advice for any women or families that are a part of the district when it comes to economic empowerment.
I'm going to say this women are the backbone of our families, they're the backbone of our communities, and they're the backbone of our economy. And for those who don't believe it, you're missing the boat. And I'm going to say this again, when you invest in women, we all thrive. And so I just think white supremacy tells us not to trust ourselves, not to value ourselves. You know, dismantling that is first starting with our own selves and our own personal narratives, that we, as women who identify as women, we have such incredible strengths and assets for our families, for our communities, for the workplace, that we have to continually to challenge those narratives, because the public narratives, those narratives become our internal narratives, and we have to constantly challenge that. And so we're here to support you. You know, there are resources out there, but it does start with having faith and belief in yourselves and starting to trust yourself. And I'm telling you, that's a system, that's a part of the system that tells you not to trust yourself and to question yourselves and to belittle yourselves. And I'm saying, no, you got to start challenging that and changing your own personal narrative. Well, at the same time, we had to deal with systemic barriers, but that's what you can do as an individual woman. I was there. I didn't have faith in myself. I was suffering and suffocating from a lack of belief in myself. I didn't think my voice mattered. And when I started realizing it, my life started changing. So, yeah, I don't know. I could go on.
I can't say it better than Diane. Trust yourself and value yourself.
Absolutely. I think the only thing that I would add is that your past or your present don't define what your capacity is to redo that. I live my life openly, also in addiction recovery. And that was a big deal when I came to the city to say, yes, hire me. And also I'm an addict in recovery. And, you know, that took a lot, but I did that not for myself, but for others to understand that, you know, when I look back to 6.5 years ago, when I had no money, I had no job, I had a fractured relationship with my children, my life was on fire. And I had nothing. And I walked out of that facility and I could never have imagined what my life looks just 6.5 years later. I am working on my master's degree. I have a wonderful relationship with my children. I have a great career doing what I love, working in a high level position. And I do that as a woman that has come through great barriers and great trauma. And for a long time, I stayed in situations that were not safe. And that were costly to me because I was too afraid to step outside of that, thinking, well, what if it got worse? Well, what if it got better? And I was worthy of those changes, and you are too. And I think you're valued just where you are, and you're valued if you climb Mount Everest tomorrow, and you're valued if you just could shower today, because sometimes that's just as significant. So I think just remember that, you know, I think just keep showing up and design the life that you want. And just because it didn't go the way you wanted or you failed, then you pick a different day. And that's one thing that recovery has taught me. So take it one day at a time. And when that's too hard, it's 1 hour at a time. And when that's too hard, it's 1 minute at a time. And sometimes, like a day like yesterday, was a nanosecond at a time. And if you can just take on what's before you in that moment, you can tackle the next one and the next one, and you can build whatever life you want. And don't apologize for the air and the space you take up.
Thank you all so much. You were so wonderful and inspiring, and you know, it's just wonderful to hear about all the work that you're doing. This is the important work, and I'm so happy we're highlighting it for Women's History Month. We'll make sure that the resources that were mentioned are shared out. I believe some of these resources are already on the Women's History Month page, but we'll make sure to update anything else as well that's been added. I'd also like to thank Omar Cabrera, our student from K Kappa, for moderating this panel discussion. You can follow K Kappa High School on Instagram. I also want to thank our wonderful interpreters, because the work you're doing is so important as well. So thank you for being here and helping this panel become more accessible. And thank you to everyone that is watching this either live or the recording later on. This will be available on the DEI Office YouTube channel to watch at your convenience. So we will make sure all of those resources are brought up as well. Wrapping up this month, the DEI office is launching a virtual art gallery from female students, different artwork and performances. And we also will have a panel discussion that will be on Facebook Live Thursday, March 31st for Trans Day of Visibility. So definitely check that out if you're able. We will also be releasing our plans for Celebrate Diversity Month, which is in April. We'll be touching on a variety of different kinds of diversity, some of which were mentioned today, including cultural and linguistic diversity, accessibility, and neurodiversity. So you can find all of that coming soon, as well as recordings for our other panels and events that happen for Women's History Month. I dropped some resources in the chat. Feel free to check out our YouTube page, sign up for our mailing list, and see what else DEI is working on. And thank you all again so much. This was a wonderful panel. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.